Welcome to the EdTech Teacher podcast. In this podcast series, we share our love of technology with you and provide you with tips, tricks, and tools to help you use technology in your classroom today. Here is your host and the EdTech Teacher creator, Tristan.
Hello everybody and welcome back to Season 2, Episode 6 of the EdTech Teacher podcast. My name is Tristan and I am the host and creator of the EdTech Teacher. On today's episode of the show, I'm going to talk to you about Anchor FM, a free podcasting tool that you can use in your classroom, or if you wanted to create your own podcast just like I did with the EdTech Teacher and share your voice with the world. So today, let's learn about Anchor FM. So today on the show, I'm going to talk to you about the free podcasting platform called Anchor. It was actually on a little podcast called the Ditch That Textbook podcast by someone you might know as Matt Miller that I learned about Anchor and the Anchor platform. And it's from listening to this podcast that I decided to go and investigate Anchor and give it a go and see how I could use it to create my own podcast for the EdTech Teacher. So today, I'm going to give you a little bit more detail about my journey with Anchor and outline some of the awesome features that it has if you are thinking about creating your own podcasts. So as I've already mentioned, I was actually listening to an episode of the Ditch That Textbook podcast from Matt Miller when he did an episode about Anchor and using Anchor. And ironically, he was actually recording that episode using the Anchor platform when he was talking about it. It was from this episode that I started thinking about a podcast and my ears started pricking up and I headed to my computer and started to explore the Anchor platform. I actually hadn't originally planned to introduce the EdTech Teacher podcast so soon, but here we are now with 16 episodes completed between Season 1 and 2 of the podcast, and as they say, the rest is history. So from something as small as having a look and exploring the Anchor app, I have created my own podcast where I get to share my love of EdTech with everybody listening to this particular episode and all of the episodes that I have so far in Series 1 and 2 of the EdTech Teacher podcast. So now that we know that we don't need a lot of equipment and Anchor is absolutely free, what are some of the other features of Anchor that make it a fantastic podcasting tool? Well, Anchor is completely cloud-based, which means you don't actually need to download and install any software on your computer or device. This is really great for me because obviously using software takes up space and takes up valuable space that you might not have available on your device. You can use Anchor on your computer or you can download the Anchor app on your mobile devices. It is so easy to access and use Anchor anywhere you have an internet-enabled application and access to the internet. So creating and recording a podcast is super simple. Simply record your audio, and I do that in segments. And the reason why I do and film my EdTech Teacher podcast in segments is because if I make a mistake, I don't have to go and re-record the whole show. That's why you always hear those little interludes, because that is the end of a segment that I have finished recording. Once you've recorded that, all you do is insert your recording into your episode. You can add some cool transitions. You can access audio from your library. And this is a really awesome feature. And the EdTech Teacher podcast intro and outro is located in my library. It was a pre-recorded, purchased piece of audio that I commissioned from someone from Fiverr, and I include those in my episodes. You can also even allow your listeners to send in voice messages, which you can include in your show. That's not something that I do on my show just yet, but it's something that might come in the future. So it's so simple, it's so easy, and like I have mentioned already, it is absolutely free. Now, the app version does have a few additional features which are really awesome, and these include things like adding songs from your Spotify playlist to your podcast. There's a few conditions on how you will be able to access and hear these songs within the podcast. There's a whole range of interludes that you can use and sounds as well, which are available from the app version of Anchor. At the moment, I'm using the online web version, but the app version is just as powerful and just as good if you're thinking about creating your own podcast. Well, I guess you're wondering how you get into podcasting and how you get your podcast out to the universe once you have created it. Well, when you're using the Anchor application, it's actually really easy. In fact, it's so simple that Anchor does all the work for you. So essentially, it actively shares your RSS address with a whole suite of podcasting sharing platforms and sites. So what this means is that your podcast will be sent out to a whole range of other providers where people can listen and access your podcast. So at the moment, my podcast is available from the Anchor FM website, as well as Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Breaker, Castbox, Overcast, Pocket Cast, Radio Public, and it's even available on Spotify. So you can listen to the EdTech Teacher podcast on almost any podcasting platform out there. There are so many that you can access through Anchor, or you can actually go and take the RSS feed from your Anchor account and add those particular podcasting platforms to your suite of available podcasting platforms for your podcast. So there's a huge range of platforms where your listeners can access your podcast. You don't just have to stay within Anchor. You can share your RSS feed with a whole range of podcasting applications and suites. So how could we use Anchor in our classroom if we don't want to necessarily create our own personal podcast series? Well, this is a really great question, and I think it's one that we need to have a think about. Now, it's just really important to remember that the terms and conditions of Anchor stipulate that users must be 13 or over in order to have their own Anchor accounts. So if you're wanting to do some podcasting in your classroom, just be aware of this. But let's go and have a look at just some simple ideas off the top of my head about how we could use Anchor in our classroom to engage our students and develop that technological capacity that our students will need for their futures. So why don't we get students to create some tutorial podcasts for exams or as study materials? A great way to get them to reflect on the content that they've learned, but also to help their peers. Now, we might also create a regular school podcast to share experiences and successes with our community. It might even be a great way to promote your school to future students, parents, and just to show the community how amazing you are. You might be able to move away from those written assignments and have students create a podcast instead. And look at that, we're going to alleviate all of those problems associated with speaking in front of people, but we're also going to allow them to develop the capacity to use technology to share their learning, to share their voice with other people. Kind of going on with that, we could use our podcasting to remove the stress and anxiety of presenting in front of an audience. Rather, we have the students create a podcast, we share that podcast, we listen to them, but they're not actually having to stand up the front, freaking out, really anxious about speaking in front of an audience. So we're still getting them to use those oral language skills. We're still getting our students to use their listening skills, but we're doing it in a way that is much more acceptable and helpful for those students who are very anxious about public speaking. So there's just a few ways that you could use Anchor in your classroom. And essentially, the way to use Anchor and incorporate it into your classroom is limited by your imagination. If you can think of a way to include Anchor in your classroom, do that. It's your classroom. It's your idea. Go and try it. If it doesn't work out, that's okay. Reflect on what didn't work and make changes for the future. Essentially, the world is your oyster when it comes to using Anchor in your classroom. All right, finally, in addition to creating a podcast with Anchor, you also have the ability to manipulate and customize a whole range of other aspects of your podcast. These include your show notes, the information that you provide on each episode. You can also include cover art, and you have access to some really great analytics about your podcast and the success of each episode. In fact, at the time of recording, Anchor is telling me that 56% of my listeners are from Australia, which makes a little bit sense because I am an Australian presenter here. 28% of my listeners are from the US, and I've even got listeners in Ireland, Singapore, the Netherlands, Canada, UK, Malta, Israel, the Philippines, and even Bangladesh. Wow! Who knew that this little old podcast would make it so far around the world? So this is a chance using Anchor to get your voice to lots of different people all around the world. When I started the EdTech Teacher podcast, I didn't expect so many people from so many different parts of the world to be accessing and listening to my podcast. I just started it because I wanted to share my love of technology with people. And now I'm sharing my love of technology all around the world. So go and have a look at Anchor and share your voice with people all over the globe and spread your love and your passion with a whole range of new people. So this has been a very brief introduction to Anchor. There are so many other intricate parts, but they're probably a little bit harder to talk about on a podcast, and you probably need to see what they are and how they work. As I've mentioned, I would suggest the best way to learn about the power of Anchor is to create your free account and just go and play around with it. It's so easy, it's so simple to use, and this could be your opportunity to create a brand new podcast series, and essentially you're going to create it within minutes. So go and have an explore, have fun, experiment, fail. Okay, I've had lots of fails. There's been lots of times where I've had to re-record segments because I've made a mistake. If I had a gag reel, it would be so full. I don't because I delete them because some of the things in there are a little bit naughty and I probably shouldn't share those with people, but it's all part of the experience. And I've learned and I've grown and I've discovered how to make the podcast flow, how to make sure that I'm not using too many filler words, and I've started to see what I can do. And I'm sure that as I continue with the EdTech Teacher podcast, it's going to get better. So go and have some fun and see what you can do with the Anchor app today. And think about creating your own podcast series or see how easy it could be to teach your students and have them creating their own podcasts in your classroom. Well, that brings us to the end of episode 6 of season 2 of the EdTech Teacher podcast. We are now halfway through season 2 already. I can't believe that we're already halfway through. Anyway, don't forget that you can follow the EdTech Teacher on Facebook. You can tweet with us on Twitter, and I would love it if you could subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm so desperate to get my own customized YouTube URL address. I need about 80 more people to subscribe to my channel so that I can make that happen. If you want to know more about today's show, you can find the links for these in our show notes on the EdTech Teacher show notes Wakelet collection. And the link to our Wakelet collection is in the description for this episode. Well, I hope that I've been able to show you how amazing Anchor is and how you could use it in your classroom. You don't have to just be somebody like me wanting to share their passion. You could be just a general educator and find a way to incorporate podcasting into your teaching and learning. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me and making it to the end of episode 6 of season 2 of the EdTech Teacher podcast. Well, that is a wrap for this episode. My name is Tristan. I am the creator of the EdTech Teacher podcast. And until next time, stay safe, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the EdTech Teacher podcast. If you've made it this far, we'll take it that you've enjoyed this week's episode. While you wait for the next episode, don't forget to check out our website, www.theedtechteacher.net, or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to stay up to date with everything from the EdTech Teacher.